Hey everyone, this is Lomi, finally getting back to some modification projects. Today I'll be working on arms and hands for Rhyllyn. I've got his current arms and hands nearby for reference, but instead of modifying them, I'll be sculpting new fantasy parts from scratch. For this project, I picked up a package of premier lightweight stone clay, because I see this get used for dolls a lot, and I've heard it's some of the best for making your own doll. It's slippery, which was not what I expected. I've never used this stuff before, and it's kind of fibery and squishy, really. I thought it would have more of a typical clay texture. So, to preserve a hole down the center of the pieces and not have to drill through them, I'm sculpting on top of plastic drinking straws. Right at first, all I'm doing is meshing clay onto the straws to get a rough approximation of the shapes I want. I'll build these up through several layers to get closer to the end result. Honestly, right off the bat, I find this clay difficult to work with compared to what I'm used to. But I also acknowledge that doing everything in epoxy clay isn't really practical. It's heavy, it's expensive, it takes forever to cure, and it's so hard that it could be difficult to sand. So I know if I'm going to be doing more sculpting in the future, I need to get used to using other clays. About the only thing that makes this particular clay appealing is that it can be soaked in water to be reactivated, and the dust from sanding can be stirred into water to turn it back into clay, so there's very little waste. When working with epoxy, all the dust is just gone. It's money out the window, and this hobby is expensive enough. But epoxies do have the advantage of being so solid that a sculpted piece can be used and painted as is. With these, I'll have to cast these parts in resin when they're done, because this clay is so soft when dry that I can snap pieces as thick as these arms with just my hands, and I am a weakling, so. Even though I'm making these with the Lottie doll arms as reference, I recently decided I'm not keeping the body Rhyllyn came with. A Lottie boy was my grail doll, and I'm super excited to be able to get him. But I've never been totally happy with his body because it wasn't the version I wanted in the first place. I wanted the thinner, softer, stylish version of the body, and he came with the muscular version, which doesn't really work for Rhyllyn's character, since the version I'm shelling is supposed to be an 8-year-old boy. I'm making his hands on a wire frame, which is different from how I made Rune's hands. Rune's were built knuckle by knuckle using epoxy clay, so this whole ordeal is a big learning process for me. And since Rhyllyn is a small kid, his hands are going to be so small, and it's going to be hard for a novice sculptor like me to get that to work. Sometimes I kind of wish I'd decided to shell some of my book characters as older versions. The series was originally written as a trilogy, but as I'm editing it, it's breaking up into smaller books because it allows me to go back and work in a lot of stuff I cut from the outline when I first wrote the story. Back then, I was so convinced that I had to perfectly meet these guidelines set by agents and publishers, and a recommendation I got over and over again was that a fantasy book from a new author should be as short as possible. While the first book is just kind of the setup, the series kind of grows out of a small occurrence on the island where the first book starts, and then ends up being this continent-wide civil war inside a massive empire. So when I was told my book was going to be too long and nobody would want it, I started cutting material, and I ended up with something that was just kind of a shell of the story I originally set out to tell. Once I started learning more about publishing and breaking away from the idea of traditional publishing being my only option, I realized the first book really should have been 2 books all along, because the first and second halves focused on really completely separate story arcs. So I split it, and I'm in the process of rewriting the second to put back all these things I'd originally cut. I feel like the story will be a lot stronger when it's done. Hopefully a little faster pace too, since a lot of the subplots came back, so there's always something happening. But it also means there are now 2 whole books before Rhyllyn's character even appears. all my doll characters are set at the stage of the book Rhyllyn is introduced in, which was originally the second book. Now it's the third. I'm not sure if I'll be splitting the third book or not because I never actually reread it after I wrote it. But I know the last book does need to be split for reasons I won't even touch right now, so I don't know if there'll be 5 books or 6. But I can safely say Rhyllyn shows up in the third, and he's just a little boy, but by the last book he's in his teens. And that was a huge digression to say it would probably have been easier to work on Rhyllyn if I had decided to make the late series version of him and not mid-series, because then he'd be SD sized and everything would be bigger. I do think the mid-series is the best place to set my doll collection though, because by mid-series all the important characters have been introduced, and I haven't killed off many side characters yet, so everybody I want to make into dolls are alive. Anyway, sorry. The process of layering on clay ended up taking me the better part of 2 weeks because the pieces are so small and light that, because I'm so inexperienced, I had to stop frequently and let it dry, because I'd reach a point where I couldn't get it to do what I wanted anymore. But eventually, everything was layered up to about the right shape, everything was dry, and I was ready to start cutting and shaping and sanding. Trying to make your own doll parts really gives you an appreciation for what doll companies do. I'm at the point in my hobby where I'm confident enough to know I can do these things if I have enough time, but I can't imagine the time investment needed in making a whole doll. When making just 2 simple forearms takes me weeks, it would probably take me well over a year of consistent work to sculpt an entire doll. And even doing this small project, I mess up so much that'll need to be touched up before I move on, too. I will say this clay sands very easily, and I can see how it would be easier to get a smooth finish with this than with epoxy. But I still prefer epoxy clay because I feel like it's more reliable and predictable. One problem I consistently have with this is that it doesn't like to stick to itself. Re-wetting an area before I add material helps, but it doesn't eliminate the problem completely. So touching up places and adding to it can be really difficult. The joints I'm cutting into these parts will need a lot more adjustment after I get Rhyllyn's new body. But even so, I'm glad that I'm moving forward, and I'm also glad that I decided to replace his body with something softer, even if it means putting finishing touches on these parts later. I've put the elbow joints aside entirely for whenever the new body gets to me, because I want to make sure the arms are the right size and shape, and that'll probably mean reshaping the elbow joint a bit too. I've got the body Rhyllyn came with up for sale, so hopefully I'll be moving forward with the rest of the project soon. One thing I do know is that I can start the rest of his clothes, so I'll probably be making his breeches while I wait. And one thing I dread is that, depending on the color match when I do get his new body, I may have to take off his face up and completely redo it so I can airbrush his head to match. I have my fingers crossed that the body I get will work out, but I won't know until it gets here. For now, at least the base sculpting for his new parts is done. I'll have to continue to work on filling in dents and refining these in the coming weeks. They need quite a bit more filing and shaping, but I think I'm learning a lot in the process, and I'm excited to see where the rest of this creation process leads. Next time I show off these parts, I'll be prepping them for casting in resin, and hopefully taking all of you through that process too. That's it for today though. Thanks for watching. Bye.